Position relative and position absolute go hand in hand together like baseball bat and baseball, like basketball and basketball net. They're pretty much inseparable and you have to consider them both. So here I have a simple example to demonstrate that. Well, I have two actually. One is to show you how it works, and then the other one, the concrete example of how you can implement that in a real life application. And I'm going to be showing that on this dropdown here in both examples. But let's first get with the basics. So here I have my dropdown inside of this smaller dark bluish container, and I also have this light bluish container. The smaller container is called container 2, the bigger container is called container 1. Now, let's say I want to move my dropdown to the top of this container here, to the top left, without actually changing my HTML. How can I do that? I can do that with position relative and absolute. So my container 1 already has the position relative applied, and I'll explain what it does in a second. And I'm gonna activate the position absolute on my dropdown, and I'm also going to deactivate the position relative from the smaller container. So I did that. I moved to my dropdown, and I'm activating position absolute. Now, first thing that happens is that my container, the smaller container, pretty much disappears. Only the border remains. Why did that happen? It happened because any element with position absolute is taken out of the flow of the page. So now technically my smaller container is empty, even though the HTML suggests that there's something inside, right? Here you can see that I have something inside, but the DOM document object model doesn't consider my container 2 as it has something. It doesn't have anything inside is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so now my dropdown still isn't inside of the bigger container, right? So I'm going to apply this top 0 rule, and my dropdown moved to the top. This is what I wanted, but I also want to move it to the left, to the very left, to the left edge, and I'm going to apply the left equals, or well, is 0. And as you can see, now my dropdown is inside of that bigger container without me actually changing the HTML. But what happened if I activate the relative, the position relative again? As you can see, my dropdown moved back down to the container, although it's still out of the flow. So the smaller container still technically from the DOM perspective, from the document object model perspective, is empty. Now, why did that happen? It happened because position absolute, element with position absolute, positions itself relative to the closest parent with the rule relative. So that's why this word relative was used, I'm assuming, because this becomes the anchor. The nearest parent with position relative becomes the anchor, like the lighthouse. And according to that lighthouse, all of the elements with position absolute get positioned, like they navigate around that, if you will. So if I deactivate position relative from my smaller container, it will move back to the top. So that's the basics of position relative and absolute. And now let me show you a concrete example of where this can be used. Okay, so now I have my dropdown, and I'm gonna show you exactly how it works. So this dropdown is pretty simple. I just click it, right, and my options show. And as you can see here, when I click inside of this HTML, the dropdown options div shows up. Now, the curious thing here is that my dropdown options has position absolute, and the dropdown, that the div that contains the whole thing, the wrapper, if you will, has position relative. Now, let's get rid of that position relative and let's see what happens. Let's, as you can see, my options just flew to the side of the screen. Why did that happen? It's because my drop-down options was looking for the nearest position relative. If it's not found explicitly defined, it will align itself according to the document itself, right? So that's why you can see that options just go flying to the top left. And that's not what I want, right? Well, now let's see what happens when my position absolute gets removed. Now my drop-down acts kind of weird, right? Like if I click it and hide those options, it looks okay. But when I try to see what's inside, it's kind of like I don't want this to be moved. I don't want the select language to be moved. I want it to be on the same place. And instead, I just want like this kind of drawer to open underneath. So that's why I was using position absolute. So how it works is this dropdown serves as a container, as an anchor. It tells those options, this is what's currently highlighted, where they should be located. First of all, they should be taken out of the flow of the page because I don't want my select language box to be moving every time I click it. And this only can be facilitated by taking those options out of the flow of the page. This is the only option. So now when I click, nothing moves, only the options show as you would expect. This is how you would expect a drop-down to work, right? So you may notice that there are some additional rules here, and those rules define where my options will be located. So if I get rid of them, you'll notice that they kind of shifted, and this doesn't look nice. This looks broken, right? So I have to decide where I want to put those options so that they look nicely. So first, I want them to be aligned with this left edge. So that's why I applied left 0. And also I can see that the top of these options is kind of hidden underneath my select language box, right? And you can especially see that when I highlight the drop-down options element in the inspector. You can see that some part of my select language box is kind of overlapping, and that's not what I want, right? So first I was testing, I just applied top 0, and this is also not what I want, but it's a good start because now my drop-down options container was aligned to the very top left of my drop-down of the whole container, of the whole wrapper. So going from that, I can just start applying some top values. So I start with 1 pixel and I'm holding down the arrow, the up arrow. So 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. And if I just hold it, I'll see that it's moving down. Whoop, I went a bit too far. So I'm going back a little bit. Now it's 40 pixels, 39, 38, 37, 36 is what I want. 35 looks also good. There's actually now no space in between the drop-down options and my select language container. You can choose either 36 or 35 will work. But now it looks well. And this is thanks to position relative and position absolute. So once again, position absolute anchors itself to the nearest nearest parent. That's important. Parent position relative. It wouldn't work the same if I didn't have my position relative in the wrapper, but instead of the drop-down label. This wouldn't work. I can actually show you that. This wouldn't work because I'm applying position relative. This wouldn't work because the drop-down label div is a sibling and not a parent. So if I apply position relative to the parent of my dropdown options, this behaves correctly. And you can see the code down below in the description. You can see the exact code. So if you have any issues with that, or just want to see how it's implemented, you can check it out. So I hope you guys liked the video. This is position relative and absolute. It's very, very simple to get once, like to understand once you see concrete examples. And I hope by now you will have no issues using that. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.